Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Haxton Knits channel. My name's Deanna and I am an American living in Okinawa, Japan. I am a master knitter and I started this channel almost a year ago to sort of share some of the knowledge I gained and just share a little bit of life in Oki with you as well. So I'm glad you're here today. If you are a new viewer, you can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Haxton Knits. And of course, over on Ravelry, we have the Haxton Knits channel where you can participate in any of our make-alongs or chatter or share pictures of your fur babies, as I often do. Here in Okinawa, fall is kind of in the air. It may not be in the air enough to justify the long sleeve clothing that I have on today, but it was a little bit rainy, a little bit foggy this morning, and I thought, oh, I miss my winter sweaters, and so I'll just put something on. So we'll see how long I can tolerate all of this. But yeah, so this week I have a finished object, finally, and I think I'm going to introduce sort of a new segment where we delve into these finished objects a little bit more. I have a kitten helper, as always. We will be often and frequently interrupted by the cats. And, oh, no, stop. Yeah, let's get started. So I do have a finished object for you today, and I've been thinking about starting a new segment on this show. We're going to call it like the finished object pattern breakdown, I think. And we're not looking at pattern modification because there are a lot of people out there talking pattern modification, and they definitely do it better than I do. My God, my cat is going to eat my hair. No, go away. And if you are interested in pattern modification, I would recommend going over to Melissa of the Knitting the Stash channel. She does a whole series on garment modification. She does it really, really well. She is a professor, so she's used to talking and teaching, and you can really tell that when you watch her on her channel. But what I want to talk about when I do my pattern breakdowns are, what does the pattern actually say, what does it not say, and how did I choose to do the things that maybe weren't said. And of course, with all of these, I'm going to find tutorials online and link them below so that you can get, oh my God. Hold on, guys. The cats have to be evacuated. So what I have happening right this moment is I have one kitten climbing up my rigged up camera. So here's my rigged up camera setting. And one kitten in my lap eating my hair. This is a nightmare. All right, we have lost the cute background, but the cats are subdued in the other room. So, okay, where was I? Finished pattern breakdown. A lot of patterns, there are things that they leave out. So I think of patterns in general categories. So traditionally, most patterns were brought or presented to us through magazines or books or some sort of publication. And in those, space was limited. So you often got very, very compressed patterns with very few details. And they assume that you have the skills to do things, or they just don't care. I don't know. I'm not sure what the thinking was. And of course, now in this modern era, we have a lot of independent people publishing patterns. Things aren't necessarily in paper print anymore, which buys us a lot more space. And so you're going to see more patterns that give very detailed instructions on how to do things. Even still, I find that patterns will either tell you what they want you to do and tell you how to do it, or tell you exactly what they want you to do, but not tell you how to do it. They may have like an abbreviation or a shorthand, but not any sort of detailed instructions, or they may not tell you what to do. And specifically, I find these in areas such as increases, decreases, cast-ons, and bind-offs. So a lot of patterns will say cast on 25 stitches. I think for the most part, we all assume that in those cases, you're going to do just the traditional long tail cast on, or same thing, a traditional bind off. Increases and decreases, especially in the areas of like left leaning and right leaning decreases. I think most knitters are familiar, right, that a knit two together is a right leaning decrease and a slip slip knit is a left leaning decrease. Unless you're me, who knits left-handed, in which case those are switched. But often in patterns, they will say just maybe decrease in pattern or decrease, or they'll always use knit two together and never use like a balanced stitch. So these are things that I find really make a difference in the finished item, and really make a difference especially in like finishing and just taking things from hand knit to more professional looking. And so I really want to start taking a look at the patterns that I'm knitting and what they say and what they don't say. So what better way to kick off this new section of my podcast than to do it with this Portage Cardigan by Melissa Shashwari. When I saw the picture for this, I knew immediately, like, I want this sweater in exactly this color. This is what I want. I'm going to make 0 modifications. Let's get started. And if you've watched my previous episodes, you know that I bought 7 skeins of Malabrigo Arroyo in the glitter colorway, and I got 4 gold skeins and 3 green skeins. And all of them were labeled no dye lot. So that was a fun surprise in the process. I did, make it work. It was fine. So I did the bulk of the body of this sweater in the gold color, and then I did the neck bands / button bands, cuffs, and ribbings and pockets in this dark green color, and it turned out just fine. I'm not unhappy with it in any way. Despite my ranting about the yarn when it first came in, I actually just really enjoy every step of this process. Another thing that really drew me to this pattern were the pockets, of course. Gosh, I love pockets, and I think everyone does. So let's just start with first impressions of this pattern as I was knitting it, how I felt about it. Right away, it became clear to me that this was not an instant gratification pattern. So I would say if you're a new to sweater knitter, maybe this might not be the one to start with, and not because of the skill level required, but because it is a little bit of a slow going process and you might need a little bit of patience. And I find that patience with knitting just kind of comes with time. I think obviously there are some people who are going to be more patient and some people who are going to be less patient. And there's going to be people who will never cast on a sweater because it's just too much knitting. And then there's going to be people who right away are like tackling, fingering weight, coat length, cardigans or whatever. But for me personally, I know when I first started knitting sweaters, they felt huge and insurmountable and like I could never get through them. And so for me, like this one probably would have never got off the needles if it was one of my first patterns. But then of course, once you have garments in your wardrobe that are yours and fit well and you really enjoy them, then I feel like you get this little bit of inertia and, a little bit more patience with casting on and knitting larger sweater projects. It isn't fingering weight, so of course, that gives you a little bit of a bonus. But let's talk about why this pattern is kind of a slow goer, patient pattern. The first thing right away that became evident was the stitch pattern on the back. So it's an all over 1x1 cable, which is going to slow you down. Like I don't know anyone who can do that at a significant speed. I did do this without a cable needle. So this pattern does give you instructions on how to do the 1x1 cable. This is, if you've ever done cabling without a cable needle, you may have seen that there's a couple of different ways to do it. And one of them involves like knitting and maneuvering the stitches all on the one needle. It reminds me of doing like a knit front back where you like knit a stitch but leave it on and then go behind. And those are the types of instructions that are given in this pattern. I found that to be a little bit more fiddly just for me. It's definitely a matter of taste, but I did the cabling where you just kind of slide your needle out of one stitch and shove it back in and pinch the stitch so it doesn't run. And I will put a link, that was very clear, wasn't it? I'll put a link down below on the way that I do cabling without a cable needle. For me, this is very fast and I've gotten very proficient at it to the point where even with larger cables, I don't normally grab a cable needle right away anymore. And if that's something you wanted to tackle was cabling without a cable needle, then this would be an excellent project to get some really good experience on, because by the time you're done with this center section, you'll be like a pro at it. So section number 1, giant 1x1 cables. gonna slow you down. Section, as soon as you get done with that, you go into a rather large section of ribbing of 1x1 rib, which will slow you down. And then you do a sewn bind off. And so here, I will talk to you a little bit more in a minute about the bind offs I chose, but again, sewn bind offs are gonna slow you down. And you think, okay, but I'm through the worst of it. But no, you have a very large section of garter stitch to pick up and knit around for your button bands, and then another huge sewn bind off. So this entire neckband is a sewn bind off too. And so all of those things are going to slow you down. As far as sewn bind offs go, I am a big proponent for them. I actually really like them. I like the tension you can get with them. And maybe this is just kind of the nerd in me, like, you know, you can geek out on yarn stuff, but to me, taking that extra time and like doing the sewing off, binding off by sewing, and just all the different finishing techniques, I always feel like that is when I am an artisan of my craft. Like, I'm taking the time to do these little details to make things nice, to make a good quality. So I get a lot of satisfaction with these kinds of finishing touches, but I do recognize that a lot of people don't. And so we'll talk a little bit about bind offs that might be more appropriate if you just can't stand to do a sewn bind off for this project. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. Like I said, I didn't do any modifications. I'm not a modification person per se, and when I do them, I tend to do them on the fly with no plan, and that doesn't always work out great. I think literally the only change I made, and it's such a minor one, you're going to laugh, when you tack down these pockets. So just to orient you to this a little bit, you will pick up stitches here and knit a big garter stitch flap, and then also knit the pocket, and then fold that all back and tack the pocket down. And one of the things the pattern says to do is to knit the pocket until you reach this cable here. And I just didn't like the way it looked when the pocket ended at the cable, because then you could see the end of the cable. I'm gonna have to take a picture of this for you. But when you stop the pocket ahead of the cable, what you see is the part of the knitting where the cable stops, and it stops abruptly. And so I did just an extra 1 or 2 rows so that I could tack down the pocket on the other side, and then the cable just looks like it like disappears into the pocket. So you don't see that abrupt finish. That's literally the only thing I changed, and I know that's just kind of a nitpicky sort of thing. There were several things in this pattern that I don't think they gave good details on, and especially the seaming and finishing. So there are several points where you're going to put seams in this project. One of them is at where where this pocket folds back and sews down. And in this case, you're going to be sewing a garter stitch section to a section of ribbing. And you're going to be sewing down knitting that goes in opposite directions. So for me, the easiest way to sew together projects are things that are meeting in the same direction. So either you're seaming 2 edges together, and so, you know, these are 2 pieces of knitting that are knit like this, or you're seaming like the top shoulder seams together, in which case you have 2 pieces of knitting that are both going like this. What gets tricky is when you have to seam things together this way, because you have to do ratios and things like that to make sure you pick up a nice edge, and you're picking up differently on each side. So I tend to do like a mattress stitch when picking up along the edge or the selvage of a piece of knitting, and then for the tops or bound off edges, you're doing more like a grafted stitch. And I will absolutely be putting tutorials down below, or links to tutorials about how to seam vertical to horizontal things together. I highly recommend Arenda Holladay's YouTube videos, and she also has a blog where she shows pictures with written instructions on how to do these. So that was challenge number 1. And then challenge number 2 is seaming shut the bottom of the pocket. So like I said, you fold this piece back tack down this seam, and then you have a seam at the bottom of the pocket to sew down as well. And I went digging through Ravelry, and a lot of the things I found, people were doing a crocheted slip stitch bind off. And initially I actually tried that, and it was okay. I didn't like, it was kind of tight, and that might be my crochet skills showing, but I didn't find it as finished and nice as I would like it to be. And so I did actually do kind of like a mini tutorial on how I bound off the bottom of this. And so I'm going to show you here, and I'll have to show you some closer up videos, but the issue with binding off the bottom of this pocket is that you have one section where you are knitting the two selvage edges together, and it's all garter stitch. So you're going to be picking up garter stitches, and this is actually my seam right here. And this is that section that was selvage to selvage with garter stitch. So this is actually the bottom edge of the pocket. I just laid it flat. And for a portion of the seaming, you'll be seaming garter stitch to garter stitch, which is where that neckband is folded back on itself. And so this is actually pretty easy. What you're just going to do is go back and forth, side to side. On one side, you're going to pick up the smiles of the garter stitch, and on one side, you're going to pick up the frowns of the garter stitch. So here is where I am picking up on this edge. So you see it's kind of like smile, frown, smile, frown. I hope that makes sense. And you do want to be kind of one stitch in. You don't actually want to pick up along this selvage edge, but the first stitch in, just because you tend to have a little bit of unevenness and a little bit less stability on the selvage. So just to make your seam a little more secure, work one stitch in. So I will pick up the smile here and pull through, and then on the other side I'm going to pick up the frown, and that will be this piece right here. So I'm just going to keep going back and forth one for one along this seam until I reach the point where the pattern changes. So at one point here you will be no longer garter stitch to garter stitch, but you're going to be garter stitch to 1 by 1 rib. And then you're going to have to pick up in a ratio. So instead of 1 for 1, because we know that these two stitch patterns are identical, you'll be doing probably 1 stitch here for 2 or 3 stitches there. So what I usually do there is I actually just count. I'll count how many stitches I have here. If it's a small seam, you know, this is a relatively short seam, so it's easy for me to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know. So I'll count how many pickup locations I have on this side and how many pickup locations I have on this side, and I'll create a ratio to pick up stitches for that. When I pick up stitches for this seam, I don't pull them tight right away. I find that I get a really uneven tension when I do try to tighten up the seam as I go. So what I will do is, you know, pick up all of these smiles and frowns back and forth, and then I will stop and slowly tighten up this seam. So I'll just grab one loose strand and gently pull it taut, and then continue working my way all the way up until the seam is closed up. So this is what the garter stitch part of the seam looks like when it's sewn up. In this case, I am working with the right sides, so these are the right sides facing up, and this will form the bottom edge of the sleeve pocket. So it'll lay like that. If you were to do this inside out, it does create sort of a raised edge. So the seam on the inside looks like this. And depending on whether you would want something like that showing, you could work this from the wrong side, and that would push this sort of seam to the outside. But I decided for this case that I would rather have that hidden away on the inside of the seam. So that is the garter stitch to garter stitch section on the bottom edge. Now I'm going to start the garter stitch to 1 by 1 rib section. So for this section, it's important to remember that you're working in fabrics that were knit in 2 different directions. So this garter stitch section, of course, was knit back and forth this way across the row, and this ribbing was worked this way across the row. So you cannot expect that the ratio between these two are going to be the same. So you have to figure out how many stitches and how many rows you're going to pick up on each side. So for me,
first I look at it and decide how I want to pick up stitches. For the garter stitch section, I'm going to continue to pick up the smile bumps as I've been doing, and I'll either pick up 1 or 2 at a time depending on what my ratio looks like. Stoli doesn't often give me snuggles, so I guess if she is accepting of love right now, we're just going to take a break and give her some love. And then when she decides she's done with me, we'll get back to filming. Hi. Yeah. Oh, noodle bones. So you're going to go down through the middle of the knit stitch and then back up through the purl stitch, which can be a little bit tricky to see. So down through the middle of the knit stitch right here, and then up. If you kind of pull apart the stitches here, you will see this purl bump. This will be the sort of frown shaped bump here, and that's going to be where you're going to come up, is just underneath the frown stitch there. And so you would go down through the knit, up through the purl stitch, come across to your other side and pick up whatever you have been picking up on this garter, whether it was the smile or the frown. And I hope that is clear to everyone when I'm talking about smiles and frowns. If not, I can put a link below. There's several tutorials that use this sort of terminology and have drawings describing that. So if you're confused, see the link below, and I'll also link below a bunch of other tutorials. Okay, so when I say I need to decide how many stitches and how many rows I'm going to pick up from, this is what I do. So on this side, I have been picking up into the smile stitches, which I just giggle every time I think about this, but here is the next smile stitch, and you're actually just going to count those all the way up the row. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up, okay? And then on this side, you're going to count every knit and purl. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and all the way up the row until we get the ratio.
Thinking about your ratio. For short projects like this, the seam is only this long. I literally count every stitch in every row and use that to work out the math. So, you know, if it's 10 stitches and 20 rows, then you have to pick up, you know, don't make me do math in public on the spot, even simple math. So for every stitch you have to do 2 rows, or, you know, for every 2 rows, 1 stitch. Or, you know, the easy math like that, it usually doesn't work out to be that easy, but that's how I do it. Even sometimes for larger edges, what I will do is I will mark the start, the finish, and like a halfway point or a quarter way point, and I'll count those stitches and do them. What the Master Knitter program would recommend is that you would knit a swatch of 1x1 rib and a swatch of garter stitch. You do the math, you get that perfect ratio, and then you do it. But my thought is, you've already got the swatches knit, you've already got the section knit, so why don't you just count what you actually knit? And that works out for me.
Alright, I am all done with this seam now, so I'm just showing you how this would look if you're wearing it. Well, you can really see, I can tell. So this would be the very bottom edge of your sweater. If you flip it, you can see this is the seam. It looks nice and neat to me. And then the inside edge, just so you can see what it would look like. And of course I have a ton of ends here, but this is the seam on the inside. There you go, and you can see the reason why I pick up not the selvage but the next stitch in is that your selvages can be a little bit uneven, and even mine, you can see there's some unevenness there. That's always been something I struggled with, especially while working through the Master Knitter program, was the evenness of my selvage stitches. So I know that that's an issue a lot of people have, and that's why it's important not to pick up the stitches of the selvage but actually a stitch in from the edge when you're doing any of these seams. And I like the way this turned out quite a bit more than I liked the practice I did with a slip stitch. It doesn't lay, you know, 100% flat. You can see that this is kind of a turned in seam, but I think once it's blocked, it'll lay a lot flatter, and I just like the stability of it. This pattern also suggests that once you seam up here, to actually seam a couple of stitches to secure the pocket. So this is the edge of the pocket here. So I'll seam a few, maybe an inch, inch and a half here, just to give a little bit of stability to this pocket. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, of course, reach out to me and I'll be glad to try to clarify that.
So as far as the bind offs go, there are 2 sewn bind offs, and I used a different bind off for both of them. So the first one you encounter is right after you finish the back of the sweater, and this is the bottom ribbing of it. It's a 1x1 rib, and they tell you, all right, so for this pattern, it does tell you to bind off using a tubular bind off. It doesn't give you any instructions on how to do that. So I am going to put below a tutorial link to the one I use when I do my bind offs. I'm a huge fan of tubular cast on and bind offs. I love them. I do them often. I know for the cast ons, there are several different ways to do them. There's like the waste yarn method, and there's like the method where you cast on half as many and then you increase with yarn overs, and then there's a long tail tubular cast on. So what am I getting at? There's a lot of different ways to do a tubular cast on. I am not thinking of a lot of tubular bind offs right off the top of my head, but I think there might be 1 or 2 different ways of doing it. And so this pattern doesn't give you any instructions on how to do that or a link to where to do that kind of bind off. So I'm going to give it to you. It'll be below. For me, tubular bind offs, I always do the 2 rows, and this, if you've done tubular bind offs, is pretty standard. You will do 1 row, if it's a 1x1 rib, of like knit, slip with the yarn in front, knit, slip with the yarn in front, knit all the way across. And then on the return row, it's still knit, slip with the yarn in front, but because you've turned around, you're now you're knitting the stitches you slipped on the previous row. And that is what helps make this kind of nice round tube that makes the tubular cast on look so nice and finished. And then you will cut a length of yarn way longer than your edge and do a sewn bind off. Similar to if you were Kitchner stitching. In fact, some tutorials will have you transfer your stitches, all the knit stitches, to the front and all the purl stitches to a second needle. And some of them will have you just kind of sew around the stitches on the same needle. Even though it takes longer, I do still always switch to 2 needles. So I will put all of my knit stitches on the front needle and all of my purl stitches on the back needle, and then do my grafted bind off. And that's just what makes sense in my brain. It's easy for me to remember how to do it, and I've had the best luck with my tension when I do it. Another thing that I do with sewn bind offs that some of you are probably going to think is insane is that I don't pay a lot of attention to my tension as I'm sewing. I actually do it fairly loosely, and then I will take a second pass and I will use my needle to just fudge the yarn and move it along and make a nice, neat, even edge. Now, that's a lot of work, and it's probably an unnecessary step if I would just pay attention as I'm sewing to my tension. But I don't, and that's just what I've always done. And like I said, I enjoy the process of finishing using these techniques. So for me, it's not a problem to do that extra step to make a really nice, even finished edge. It is important not to pull these too tight, so it's easy to want to make your edge neat and end up pulling really tight and forgetting that this is designed to stretch. So it still needs to stretch, but you don't want it to flare when it's relaxed. So tension is a little bit of an issue on this. It's actually a little further than I wanted to go down the instructions on how I do cast-ons and bind-offs and stuff, but for me, the important part is finding good tutorials and linking them below so that you guys can find them and use them if you want to. So for the bind off for the neck edge, the neck band, so this is the neck and what would be a button band, the pattern recommends the Elizabeth Zimmerman sewn bind off, and I'm actually really excited that the pattern recommended different sewn bind offs. Like, they at least told you which bind off they used because their pattern looks so nice and finished. And I totally agree. Like this particular bind off looks very nice against a garter stitch fabric. Whereas the tubular bind off, like I absolutely love a tubular bind off with a 1x1 rib specifically. I don't even like it with a 2x1, 2x2 rib. So I was excited to see that they recommended that. Again, there was no link or instructions on how to do it. So I will link one below for you guys. And I would absolutely recommend the Sewn bind off for this, but I think you could probably get away with like an Icelandic bind off, which is not a sewn bind off, so it's a little bit quicker. And I'll put a link to that too. Both of these are really good, and they make a nice finished edge for garter stitch. Like they kind of blend into the stitch pattern nicely. Let's see if you can see this here. Yeah, I think that's like such a distinguished feature of a sweater is when the bind offs match the stitch pattern, match the elasticity, and like just really work well with the garment. I think that's actually all I wanted to talk about this guy. So yeah, the sewn bind offs, the grafting, there was increases and decreases, but she did a good job of laying out which ones she wants to use, and I think they looked really nicely, so I won't jump into that today. I think that's it for this particular pattern. I have not washed or blocked it yet. So it did get a halfway point wash and block, and that's something I've mentioned before. So I had just finished doing the back panel, and it was looking very small to me. I was worried that it wasn't going to be big enough. And so what I did was I put it on some waste yarn and I blocked just that back panel, and absolutely the stitch pattern just bloomed and opened up, and now it fits great. I think part of the perception that it wasn't going to fit while I was knitting it was, one, the stitch pattern pulls in a lot, and two, the fronts of this cardigan are actually pretty short compared to a traditional cardigan. It's not designed to button shut or close shut. But of course this will add a lot. You can see how much bigger this neckband button band is from the front segment. And so I had this perception that it was going to be itty bitty because I didn't have that front band on. So if you are working on this project, do not distress. It will bloom, it will get bigger. If you're scared, take it off the needles and block it. So as a result, the back of this has been blocked, but the sleeves and the band have not. And oh, I forgot to mention another thing that contributes to the length of this project is that the sleeves are long, full sleeves to begin with, but then they're also designed to be folded back. So you have an extra 4 inches of knitting that you wouldn't have standard. And I would still absolutely recommend doing it because the cuffs are just really nice and chunky and warm, and they give this sweater the feeling of like substance, like it's just really well constructed and well made. As far as works in progress go, I actually don't have big progress to show you. I was really pushing hard to finish that cardigan so I could share it with you today. I have been plugging away on the Night Shift by Andrea Mowry. This is her shawl pattern in the series of patterns she has using this slip stitch design. She has, I think I've mentioned before, a cowl, a hat, a sweater now, and a shawl, and the Night Shift is the shawl version. It's, of course, I'm halfway through the row, so I can't show it all to you, but it's coming along really nicely, and it's an excellent pattern for using up your own handspun yarn if you're not sure what to do with it. So I've been just plugging away on this, and I'm absolutely loving the way it's turning out. So there will be more to come on that one, I am sure. I've reached the stage in this pattern where each of the rows feels incredibly long and takes me quite a while to get through, so I'm sure the progress is going to slow down on this one. It's funny, the pattern inertia, right? When you first cast on a pattern, you're like so excited, I want to knit, and then you kind of hit that slog, and then as you get close to finishing again, you're like so excited, I want to knit. So we're kind of in that middle slog right now on that pattern, but that is okay. It's going to continue to come along. My great tapestry did not get a lot of love this week, but is coming along. You can almost see all of it here. I'm excited because I've gotten to the part where the birds are up at the tops of the trees, and so I'm starting to knit little birds, and it's giving me a break from this sort of never-ending branches and trees pattern that's coming along. But I will have a lot more to share with this as I get further along with it. Just wanted to show you that I have not forgotten this pattern. It is still going on. So what is next? Future projects. You know, you just bound off one project, which means of course you have to cast on another one. There's a blanket pattern that I've been looking at in some Knit Picks yarn that has been calling my name for weeks. I know I've mentioned it in previous episodes, but I swore to myself I would not knit it until I finished all of my Knit Picks yarn from that great tapestry pattern, because I bought a lot. And so that will have to wait. I have been toying around with the idea of knitting traditional knitting patterns using modern yarns. And this idea came to me, if you have watched my previous episodes, I knit the Luminosity sweater and hat by Tanis Fiber Arts. And those patterns are pretty standard Fair Isle stitch patterns. It's not modern. To me, it's a very traditional stitch pattern using stranded color work. But what makes her pattern special are the color palette that she uses in these like electric yellows and really bright colors. And that got me thinking that it might be time to cast on a hat or something using that. Let me show you the yarns I'm thinking of. So I've been thinking about using yarns that are more modern with these traditional stitch patterns. This one here is Crafting My Chaos, and it's micro stripe. It's called Tie-Dye Party Micro Stripe by Crafting My Chaos. And this Crafting My Chaos, take a drink every time I say it. And this yarn comes from a indie dyer in Texas. I bought it when I was there at the Yarnivore shop, and I've been just dying to knit things with it. So maybe I was thinking this and this yarn together, because they have just such electric colors and are so bright. This beautiful yarn is Toby Roxanne Designs. Color is Everything, their special sport, and the color is called City Night. I am 90% sure I got this in a knit crate. I'm pretty sure that's where this came from. And you could see on the camera here, it's just this like luminous, electric, beautiful blue color that I have been dying to knit with. I've also been thinking about maybe instead of the tie-dye party, this yarn, it's actually on the needle right now, so is a little bit hard to see because I have used it in a project and then frogged it before, but this is Lemonade Shop, and they do a whole bunch of these beautiful, primarily one color with like little streaks of rainbow through them. And I will link some pictures. There's actually like a weaving pattern that I've had in mind for using this yarn too, but I don't have enough yarn to do that right now, so we'll see. This is future plans. For those of you who are wondering, I did not make any progress on my weaving. It's been, I think, probably a month since I warped my alpaca project. The problem is kittens. Yeah, the cats, every time I sit down with it, they're just like in the loom, on the weft, like, so there won't be any weaving for a little while, at least until the kittens become full-grown adult cats. And I think that's all for my knitting projects this week. I did get a very sweet gift in the mail. My mom, she sent me this book. Now, she insists that there was no ulterior motive here. This is Sweaters for Dogs, 15 knitting projects to keep your dog comfortable and cozy. Now, I don't own a dog. However, she has two that she loves dearly. So she insists that my dad picked out this book and sent it to me, and that there was no ulterior motives in mind, but I think perhaps there's going to be a dog sweater on the needles for her anyway. Spoiled. I love my family, so they will get patterns or projects. They're all pretty straightforward. I feel like I could rock one of these out in, you know, an afternoon or maybe a weekend, depending on how things are going. I also think that perhaps I could put one of these on my kittens. I have a kitten for the first time in my life who is like willing to wear clothes. Actually, she is willing to let me do whatever I want because she just doesn't really care about anything. So we'll see. There might be cat sweaters. There might be dog sweaters. She also sent me this lovely face mask. There you go. All right, so for those of you who can't read this, it says knitting is not a hobby, it's a 2020 survival skill. Now, I will say there are knitting needles on here, but the main item are crochet hooks, which I think is funny. I love when advertisers or things, they see knitting and they put crochet hooks on. I even saw a really interesting picture up on Reddit recently, and it was like a picture of it was a woman crocheting with one single knitting needle. And I just thought that was insane and crazy. But yeah, true to form, knitting is a 2020 survival skill, and I agree completely, at least as far as my own mental health and sanity has gone. All right, let's move on to the Life in Okinawa section here.
For Life in Okinawa this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the tradition of hajichi. So if you are not familiar with Japan, or maybe if you have just a little idea of Japan, you may know that in Japanese culture, tattoos are not really accepted or acceptable. This is obviously changing with modern times and, tattoos becoming more common in all parts of society. But traditionally, tattoos in Japan are associated with criminals and like the Yakuza and things like that. And it is part of Japan law that tattooing is like illegal. It's not allowed. And actually that just changed here in Okinawa like this month or last month, where they now made tattooing legal. Typically in Japan, tattoos are discouraged or not legal, especially as you go further back in time. So what I discovered really like this week is that Okinawa used to have a tradition of tattooing. As I've mentioned before, Okinawa originally was not part of Japan. It was an independent kingdom, the Ryukyu Kingdom. And during the time when Japan was sort of taking over this area, they made it illegal to have tattoos. And there's kind of a lot of misinformation. So I want to start this out by saying that I am giving you the information that I have learned from a brief day or two of looking up and reading articles. So I can't say with 100% certainty what's the most accurate, but I can just present to you what I've read recently because I found it interesting. So Okinawa had a tradition of tattooing of women, and it wasn't like men tattooing women, it was women tattooing women. It was a powerful tradition, and it wasn't, I think, what some people try to make it sound like, where it's a marking of marriage or something like that. In fact, a lot of the upper class women had it, and the priestesses and things like that would have these tattoos. They're typically done on the backs of the hands, and then people, sometimes they'll extend up further up the arm. And the articles I read showed that it was actually very interesting. A lot of these tattoos started when the girls were very, very young, sometimes like before the age of 10 years old, and continued all the way through their lives. So there were instances of like grandmothers getting tattoos for their first grandchild being born. And there was one of the articles I read talked about tattooing arrowheads on the fingers when a woman got married. And it was symbolic of her leaving her home when she got married, never to come back. And they said it was similar to when you shoot an arrow, like the arrowhead never comes back. So I thought that was very interesting. Another symbol that was mentioned on a couple of these articles was the circle to represent a spool of thread, and a square to represent a sewing box. Skills that they can sew or cook. And so recently there has been sort of a tradition of trying to bring this back into, back to light. So there's a female tattoo artist named Yoshiyama who has been kind of trying to bring this back, the traditional tattooing of the Okinawan Islands. And it's interesting because as I searched for information about this, I found some things that were sort of negative, saying the women were tattooed to make them ugly so that people coming like for slave trading wouldn't take them. Or the women were tattooed when they were married as like some sort of symbol of being like possessed or something like that. But vastly, the articles I found said no, that it was like a symbol of beauty and something that the women were very proud of. And it's funny, I even found an article where a man was quoted having interviewed his grandmother or his great-grandmother-in-law who had these tattoos, and she said, oh, that's all nonsense. We just tattooed our hands for fun. The girls would get together and put whatever symbol came to mind onto their hands. And I tend to believe that too. Like, I really think, thinking about the way children are, or young girls are, or humans are in general, that, you know, something starts and then you lose that sense of maybe tradition or sacredness because it becomes trend. So I don't know. I am definitely an outsider looking in at this, but to me it was very fascinating because I associate Japan and Japanese culture with no tattoos, or not no tattoos. There's definitely a significant tattoo culture, but no like positive or acceptable, mainly acceptable tattoos. So I hope you have enjoyed some of these pictures. The local museum here did a short display linking some of these tattoo traditions between Okinawa and Taiwan. And of course, Okinawa has a long history of trading among many of the cultures in this area. So when you come to Okinawa, you will see those influences of China and Korea and Taiwan and anywhere else that may have come into contact with this place as a trading route.
All right, guys, that's going to be it for my show today. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Haxton Knits, and please, at any point, feel free to link in your progress on Instagram. I use the hashtag Haxton Knits MAL for the make-alongs and knit-alongs, or just whatever, tag me. I'm excited to see what you guys are making. I am looking forward to seeing you guys next time, and keep knitting and have a great week.